Welcome to day 2 of the Doing Business Conference. I know from conversations I had with many people yesterday, there was just a lot of very positive feedback about the quality of the speeches, the insights that both the speeches had and the presentations, and it really is causing a lot of fresh thinking, and I think that's a very, very healthy thing. As good as yesterday was, though, I think today holds at least as much promise for motivating our discussion and dialogue around these very, very important issues. We have, just by way of logistics this morning, a morning keynote. Then we'll have, and I'll return to that in a moment, we'll also have a coffee break. And I realize everybody sees coffee break as simply an opportunity to get some refreshments, and that's really very important. But you'll notice that we have a little extra time built into these coffee breaks, and the reason is that I think as you attend more and more conferences, you learn that a lot of the very good ideas that happen at conferences happen by way of sharing reflections and observations on speakers, and that happens at coffee breaks. So please do take advantage of that. Then we will turn to a very distinguished panel that will look at the very important role of benchmarking generally and what role benchmarking can play, will play, ought to play, benchmarking like what is being done in the Doing Business Indicators project. So, and then we'll have some very wonderful closing remarks, I am quite sure. So that's the logistics for today. For this morning, we have a keynote speaker who is Robert Cooter, who is the Herman F. Selvin Professor of Law and Economics at the Bolt School of Law at the University of California, Berkeley. Bob is a prolific author whose work, I think, very generally has really changed a lot of thinking by opening pathways both from the legal community to the economics community and the other way around, from economics to law. If you think about how it is that, certainly I think as an economist, I've always thought it was really nice that you'd bring economic tools to bear on legal issues. That's an easy part to accept. But I think the harder part, but maybe even more valuable part of what Bob's done with his research is to help bring foundational issues in legal analysis into economics, to help vivify economics, which is sometimes a bit sterile. So we are delighted to have Bob here today. He has done this work in a variety of vehicles, through original research articles, through monographs, and through books. Most recently, a book entitled Solomon's Knots, Not How Law Can End the Poverty of Nations. I think he'll use that perhaps as a springboard for his remarks today. I know I am very excited about having him here today as a speaker. Please help me welcome Professor Robert Cooter.
Well, I want to thank John Mayo and the Georgetown hosts, and also the Global Indicators Group, especially Augusto Lopez Claros, for the invitation to talk to you today. I've spent my career developing the economic analysis of law, and I have spent a lot of time traveling around in developing countries. And a few years ago, I decided it was time to bring the two together, and the result is this book that you see here, Solomon's Knot, modestly subtitled, How Law Can End the Poverty of Nations. And today's talk, I add the phrase, how law and doing business can end the poverty of nations, because I really think that the Doing Business report is essential to effective law or living law, and I think that living law is essential to economic development. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to describe the framework in this book and in my subsequent writing for the interaction between law and economics in promoting economic growth and especially development in developing nations. Now, one of the things about compound growth is it happens unimaginably fast. 2% a year for a century, which is roughly the growth rate of the United States over the last century, is a 7-fold increase. 5% is a 130-fold increase, and 10%, roughly the growth rate of China in the last 30 years, if it were to be sustained for a century, would be a 14,000-fold increase. That's why Robert Lucas, the Nobel Prize winner in economics, said, when you start thinking about growth, it's hard to think about anything else. It's hard to think about anything else because the effects of growth overtake the effects of static efficiency or redistribution. That is to say, you can redistribute wealth and you can improve the efficiency of the productive process, but the effects of that will be small in comparison to compound growth. If there's a trade-off, you have to go with compound growth if you care about human welfare. And I've spent my whole life doing static efficiency analysis because I pioneered the economic analysis of law, which is often referred to as the comparative statics of legal rules. And in the economic analysis of law, we ask whether one rule, say strict liability versus negligence in the rule of accidents, or say expectation damages versus reliance damages in contract law, we ask which rule has more efficient effects on the incentives of actors. And that's a static analysis. So one day I felt like the Roman Catholic priest who sat up in bed in middle age and said to himself, maybe Buddha was right. So I feel like I was doing a lot of things that weren't quite right. It's not they're entirely wrong, but they're not quite right either. So I've been trying to rethink the economic analysis of law in light of economic growth and innovation. And I think that when you do that, it partly redresses the imbalance in trade between the two disciplines. That is to say, the economic analysis of law heretofore has been much more the exportation of economics into law than the importation of law into economics. And I think that that's one of the reasons why growth seems to be a mystery. Because I think what's mysterious about innovation are the very things that law is reaching to. So I hope that in giving this lecture this morning, I can make you appreciate why law should be imported into economics in order to understand the growth process. Now, this is a picture of Mount Everest rising above the Ganges Plain. It's back there, one of the tallest mountains back there. And the point of this is that when growth occurs, the result is that those nations that grow fast outstrip those that fail to grow. And what we have in the world today is we have a huge increase in international wealth. The wealth of nations has increased far more than in any historical period. And the rich nations, the gap between the rich nations and the poor nations has grown larger, although the wealth of the poorest nations has, in most cases, not declined, or it's increased modestly. So it's like Mount Everest rising above the Ganges Plain. It didn't rise up by forcing the Ganges Plain down. It rose up by growing fast when the Ganges Plain did not. And that's the correct picture of what's happened in the world. Now, if we have time today, we can talk about whether there is a correlation between the growth rate and the level of development. You know, if there is a positive correlation, that means there's a divergence in the standards of life in the world. If there's a negative correlation, it means there's mobility and convergence among the nations of the world. I'm not going to talk about that now, but I just want to rest content at this point with the observation that the world's economies have grown a whole lot, and the richer nations have gotten richer, while the poor nations have not gotten poorer and often richer themselves. Now, the key idea in much of static efficiency economics is the notion of the production function and the production frontier. And there is something else that's, I think, the key notion in growth, and that's a business venture. And let me give you two examples, and I'll explain why I think it's so different from static efficiency analysis. The Joint Stock Corporation was basically invented in England and Holland in the 17th century for the spice trade. And this is the way such a venture would work. in some town on the south coast of England, a ship's captain, who was bold and knowledgeable, would propose a trip to the Spice Islands, to Indonesia. And it would take a couple of years. And it was very difficult because the way was not entirely charted. A lot of secrets were kept. The captain would claim that he knew how to get there. He would have to convince people that when he got there, he would be able to trade and get the cargo back while escaping the Indonesian pirates and the Dutch pirates. And then when he got back, the cargo would be sold. What actually happened is very much like the IPO or the sale of a corporation in Silicon Valley, as I'll explain to you, because when the ship made port, the stockholders came to the port and they held what was called a general court on the dock, and they divided up the spices, and they all went home with their share. And it was this mechanism of finance through a joint stock operation that made these highly risky ventures feasible. Now, of course, most of these ventures didn't succeed. The ship sank, they didn't get to the right port, their cargoes were stolen by pirates. Sometimes the captain decided, instead of returning to port to divide the spices, he'd go to another port and sell them all for himself. So there are lots of problems involving the cooperation between the financiers, the stockholders, and the entrepreneur, the ship's captain in these cases. And this structure is very much similar to a startup company in Silicon Valley. A startup company in Silicon Valley, somebody has an idea that's bold and extremely risky. There's no one who is willing to concentrate the risk that would be involved in financing the entire enterprise. Especially the founders of the company are not capable or willing to do that. So you have to organize a joint stock company, bring in money from a lot of sources, and if the whole thing succeeds, you make a lot of money and you divide it up and you go on to the next business venture. Now, the characteristic of a business venture is that you earn extraordinary profits if it succeeds. And as a consequence, the business venture is itself a disequilibrium phenomenon. You can't get at it through the notion of production functions in equilibrium, as I'll explain. Now, before I do so, I want to give you an example from nature, because we learn a lot about business ventures from evolution. And this is the wonderful story of Humphrey the Whale. Now, this is actually something that happened about 15 years ago in the Bay Area. A California gray whale swam under the Golden Gate and into San Francisco Bay. And then instead of turning around and swimming out, as great whales usually do, it headed up the Sacramento River. And this was a media delight. The helicopters were flying overhead filming all this. And it got a ways up the Sacramento River, and then it got stuck on a sandbar. And it should have died from dehydration, but of course, the local Greens hauled it off. And when it got back in the Sacramento River, it headed back up the Sacramento River again until it got stuck again. And finally, after a while, it gave up and turned around and swam out. Now, what Humphrey the Whale was trying to do was this. Humphrey the Whale was trying to find the great inland sea. Unfortunately, it doesn't exist. But if it did exist, and Humphrey had found it, and Humphrey had then been able to swim back out and get Humphretta and get her to come back up with him, Humphrey would have founded an entire new race of whales. And that's my model for how a lot of economic development succeeds. There are risky ventures in new areas where mostly businesses fail. In the United States, less than half of new corporations are around 4 years after they're created, usually gone bankrupt or disappeared. It's extremely risky, but it's also the way the world is transformed. So let me describe by this diagram here the course of a business venture. In the beginning, what has to be done is capital and labor have to be combined to develop something. I'll talk about that process later. That's what I'm going to focus on. The combining of capital and labor to develop a new idea. And as this picture illustrates, the development costs money. And if it succeeds, when it's launched, there's a period where there are very few competitors, a period of monopoly. The monopoly may be created with the help of intellectual property law, is to say you may be given a legal monopoly, or it may be created not so much by law, but by secrecy, which is in turn reinforced by the law of trade secrets. So that monopoly is created because you develop an idea first, and it takes other people a while to figure out how to compete with you. And in that stage, you make quite a bit of money. I got it making 7 here. And then your competitors start to figure out how to compete with you. They see money is being made, and they either figure out how to invent around your patent, or your patent expires, or you have no patent, and they figure out your trade secret. One of the things you do in Silicon Valley is you try to hire the employees of other corporations because you think they're going to carry information that would be hard to obtain otherwise. And eventually, this process settles down into an equilibrium where, with perfect competition, as we know, profits are zero. That is to say, profits are the normal rate, not higher than that. So this whole process, as I've got it, there's the benefit to the corporation is a total of 11 in revenues minus costs of 8, so it's pretty profitable. But in the end, you fall into perfect competition where there is no longer any profitability. So when I told you that what's interesting about growth is what's going on out of equilibrium, you see what I mean. Once we get to equilibrium, growth's over. The innovation has stopped. Now all we're doing is trying to achieve static efficiencies. But before that happens, we're actually trying to develop a new product. And it's that development of new product that drives the innovation that causes things to grow and causes compound growth. And the law is intimately involved in the ability to launch business ventures. It's probably the case that the spice trade could not have come into existence without the joint stock corporation. If it could have come into existence, it would have had to have been on a much smaller scale. So the legal innovation of the joint stock corporation made the spice trade possible. Similarly, the great invention in Silicon Valley is venture capital. In much of the world, there isn't venture capital the way we have it in Silicon Valley, and there are often legal obstacles that prevent it. For example, I started a company which succeeded, and our lawyer was the biggest law firm in Silicon Valley, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati. And Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati has become the largest law firm in Silicon Valley because when you come to it as a startup, what they do is they defer all payments. They defer all payments until you have what's called a significant capital event. That's, for example, an IPO or the sale of your business. At that point, you have to pay the hourly fees that were billed against you. That means that very often they don't get any hourly fees at all. In addition to those hourly fees, they get stock. If your company succeeds, that stock is very valuable to Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati. If you fail, it's of no value. So Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati is some combination of an angel investor and a venture capitalist. It's actually actively participating in the selection of firms that will succeed in Silicon Valley and will be financed. Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati helps you to present your business plan and introduces you to venture capitalists when that time comes. Now, in much of the world, that is illegal. For example, I spend quite a bit of time in Hamburg, Germany, where they have a great law and economics center. And one of the characteristics of German law is that German lawyers can't take stock in the organizations that they're representing. So that's simply not, that aspect is not possible in Germany. And I can tell you that in the original couple years of our company, our legal fees were very high, maybe 20 or 30% of our total costs, because after all, we didn't have a corporation. We had to choose our corporate form. We didn't have employee contracts. We didn't have contracts with our buyers. We had lots of tax issues that we had to figure out. So our legal fees were very high, and the fact that a venture capitalist, Wilson Sini, Goodrich, and Rosati, financed our legal costs was very important to us. All right, now let me go on and explain three forms of innovation, because when I talk about innovation as being what drives compound growth, some people, particularly some people who are economically trained, think that developing countries don't innovate, they only imitate. That the innovation actually occurs in the first world and the imitation occurs in the second and third world. And I think that's incorrect in the sense that a lot of technological innovation does occur in the first world, where there are great universities and great research institutes. But there are a lot of other kinds of innovations that are essential in business, such as innovations in markets and innovations in organizations. And here I have two examples from Mexico, a country I know reasonably well, where the richest man in the world, at least according to Forbes a couple years ago, Carlos Slim, his vast empire of wealth was built first on bringing cell phones to Mexico. The second richest man in Mexico is a guy named Salinas, who owns a series of stores called the Electro stores, as well as TV stations and a lot of other stuff. And what he figured out he was the guy who figured out how you could sell a refrigerator, say, or a washing machine to a poor Mexican, because they had to buy on credit. And the legal system is way too clunky to enforce consumer debts through the formal law. And he figured out how you could do it through a series of contracts and innovations involving social norms in Mexico. And so he became the second richest man in Mexico. Now, the main point is this. I'm not that concerned about just saying exactly what's technological, what's market, what's organizational innovation. The main thing that I'm concerned about is the fact that whatever the form of innovation may be, the profile of a business venture that's necessary to make it start looks a lot like this. In other words, the set of legal problems that you face, whether you're trying to create a new silicon chip in Silicon Valley, or whether you're trying to bring a new business to Mexico, are a lot the same. One day I spent the day driving around Mexico City looking at potential sites for Dunkin' Donuts, because my host thought that there could be a big market for Dunkin' Donuts in Mexico City. But he also recognized that in order to find out, first of all, he'd have to develop this idea by putting a lot of capital into it. Then he'd launch it and see if it succeeded. And then if it really did succeed, there'd be a lot of imitators making donuts as well. And eventually he'd fall back into the situation of normal profits. And the whole point of that ride was to make the extraordinary profits that goes with being the first to innovate, if in fact the innovation is good. So I think that this characteristic of the business venture is characteristic of the growth process everywhere, not just in developed countries where there's technological innovation. It's also in developing countries where there are innovations in markets and organizations. Otherwise, we could actually have planning that worked in developing countries, but planning doesn't work very well. It's kind of like Humphrey the Whale. Mother Nature does best by a kind of mutation process that doesn't involve working things out through a government plan. So, for example, we know that India had a kind of central planning, and part of that plan did not include IT. It did not include all these call centers and the like. All that came from somewhere else. In China, in 1975, at the end of the Cultural Revolution, China was one of the poorest countries in the world. It was also one of the most lawless countries in the world. People sometimes imagine that the Chinese success proves that law is not important to economic growth. In fact, it proves the opposite. Because just as China grew very fast, so its law improved very fast. And the innovations in its law first began with the privatization of the communes in 1980. And when a free sector was created, it experienced explosive growth. And then the Chinese leadership said, well, maybe we ought to try a free sector somewhere else other than in agriculture. And so they began to try it in new export industries. This is an example of innovations in markets and organizations that turned out to be spectacularly successful. Now I want to explain, and I told you that I was particularly interested in this first phase here, where capital gets combined with a new idea. And this involves what I call the double trust problem. And I would like to give you an example so that you'll remember exactly what the fundamental problem is in the economics of ideas. I had a friend from graduate school who worked at a Boston bank. And one day he received a letter, and when he opened it, it simply said, I know how your bank can earn $5 million. And for $2 million, I'll tell you. That's the essence of the double trust problem. Because if this idea is really worth $5 million, then it would be worth it for the bank to pay $2 million to get the idea. But the bank isn't going to pay $2 million to get the idea until it knows what the idea is. And if it knows what the idea is, it's probably not going to see any need to pay anything for the idea once it's got it. So this is this problem with innovative ideas. Usually you can't patent them, you can't protect them, you can't make a proper futures contract. You try to make a contract between the two to solve it, and there's such radical incompleteness you can't do it. Because if you make a contract of the form, well, the bank will pay you $2 million if it turns out they like your idea, then you tell them the idea and the bank says, oh, we already thought of that. It's this idea over here. We described it a little differently from you, but it's the same idea. Okay, so you see, it's really impossible to make contracts of that kind. So the fear of the innovator with a good idea is that the financier will steal the idea from him. And the symmetrical fear is the fear that the financier will have his money stolen from him by the innovator. And there's plenty of that in Silicon Valley. There's plenty of companies in Silicon Valley that never make any money, but they spend a lot of it. And they spend it especially on executive salaries and perks that use up the funds that were given to them for another purpose. So there is, in the development stage, where an idea is combined with capital, a double trust problem, the double trust dilemma of development. And the double trust problem is that the innovator has got to trust the financier with his innovative idea, and the financier has got to trust the innovator with his money. And that's where the law is so important, because solving that problem involves the law. And here's this very sophisticated diagram to show you the idea. The innovator has the idea, the investor has the capital, and they each have to trust each other. Now, when that gets solved, a business venture gets launched. So a lot of the law that provides the infrastructure for growth, the infrastructure for development, that's the way I think of law. I think of it as the soft infrastructure for economic development. And a lot of that infrastructure needs to focus on how you solve the double trust dilemma. Now, when we talk about law, we must be careful about how we use the word, because some people, when they talk about law, only think about formal institutions. They only think about state law. They only think about courts and administration. But there's another completely different way of using the term law, which is best exemplified by law and anthropology, because the original work in law and anthropology dealt with stateless societies. So if you're going to talk about the law of the Eskimo or the law of the Kapalku, for example, to take two great studies by Pospisil at Yale, if you're going to talk about the law of a stateless society, the law must not mean the formal law of the state. Otherwise, it's an oxymoron. So I think that, in fact, law also refers to relationships and norms. And the way those relationships and norms interact with the state is the key to legality. So, for example, much of private law in the common law tradition is supposed to be found by the courts rather than made. And the term found is supposed to refer to the fact that the courts see what the social norm is. And if the social norm is sufficiently worthy, they raise it to the level of enforceability by the state. So, for example, if you're involved in an automobile accident, the question will be asked whether you were negligent or not. And whether you are negligent or not will probably determine whether or not you're liable. And whether you're negligent or not will be determined by the community standards with respect to safe driving. So the community norms are built right into the law of torts itself. The same is true of the law of contracts. When the law of contracts was, much of the modern law of contracts was especially famously developed by an English judge named Judge Mansfield. And what Judge Mansfield did is he studied very carefully the actual business practices where the law was going to be applied, because he was looking in those practices for those norms which could be improved by raising them to the level of state law. So, in fact, there's an interaction between social norms and formal state law. And when I talk about the law, I mean the living law. And by the living law, I mean the law that's effective. And effective law requires the right relationship between social norms and the state. Many laws take the form of an obligation backed by a sanction, such as you can't drive over 70 miles an hour, and if you do, you're subject to this fine. Or you have to keep this promise that you made in this contract, and if you don't, you're liable for expectation damages. Many laws have the form of a sanction attached to an obligation. Indeed, that's the definition of law in a classical tradition of Anglo-American jurisprudence. Now, that idea of a sanction attached to an obligation is very important, because you see the connection right away to economics. You see what was the opening for law in economics. And that's because if you increase the sanction, you expect the sanction behavior to diminish. And in economic terms, that's just the proposition that the demand curve slopes down. So the proposition that sanctions deter, which lawyers talk about all the time, is just the proposition that the demand curve slopes down, except there's one huge difference, and that is the downward slope of the demand curve has been analyzed and reanalyzed with a sophisticated level of theory that far exceeds what the law has been able to contrive. It also not only is backed by theory, but backed by econometric estimations as well. So the notion that the living law is effective law. The living law is effective insofar as the sanctions actually change behavior, insofar as the demand curve actually slopes down. The more it slopes down, the more abruptly the quantity falls as the price of the sanction rises, the more effective deterrence is, and the more powerful the law is. Now I want to go to finances in Silicon Valley. I've got to hurry, don't I? I should finish in just a couple of minutes. I explained to you that the living law is a matter of the combination of social norms with the formal law. And one sees this beautifully at work in Silicon Valley because in the beginning of a business venture where capital has to be combined with an idea, there is such radical indeterminacy in contracts that you can't constrain the behavior through formal sanctions. And as a consequence, in order to constrain unwanted behavior, unproductive behavior, uncreative behavior, you need to draw heavily on relationships. And that's why in Silicon Valley we sometimes say that the first stage of finance of a startup company is relational finance. It's financed on the basis of knowledge of the innovator, not knowledge of the market and the technology that is actually going to be created. In the first phase in Silicon Valley, we sometimes say that finance depends upon the 3 F's, which is family, friends, and fools. Because your family and your friends are the people who know you well enough to put dollars behind your promise to try to develop a product. Family and friends will do that. That's why so many new enterprises start, for example, if you're Swiss or Israeli, they very often start with the army. There's nothing like a couple of years in a tent with somebody else to get to know them. And when you get to know somebody else, then you think maybe you can trust them, even though the contract you're going to make is radically indeterminate, radically open. Now, relational investment, however, is not enough. You need more money than that. You need strangers' money. And the second stage is what I call private finance, where you negotiate with venture capitalists, or say in Germany, you negotiate with large banks in order to get loans, to get stockholders with preferred shares. And the final stage is public finance, where you actually sell your shares to the broad public, and then you come under all kinds of laws. Now, the characteristic of this movement, oops, I'm sorry, I seem to be hitting things when I don't want to. The characteristic of this movement is it's a movement from reliance more on social norms and less on formal law. You still need formal law. You still need contracts right there in the beginning among friends. Especially you need contracts that are often unenforceable, but at least they get clear what each side expects of the other. But as you move down from relational to private, from private to public, the use of law becomes more intensive. Now, in many countries of the world, relational finance is about all there is. Thank you. You can't, if the law is weak enough, you can only deal with your family and friends. And as a consequence, you get big trading families, but you don't get many outside investors. And it's part of the development of the law to provide the legal infrastructure for cooperation between investors and entrepreneurs with new ideas, such that you can broaden the scope of cooperation and incorporate increasingly distant relations, either private contracts where between parties that where they're not family or friends, but they do bargain with each other individually, or public markets where that personal dimension is entirely gone. Now, I want to say something substantive about the principles of the living law that are essential to growth. And here, most of this is going to have to be left for Q&A. And the first principle is what I call the property principle for innovation. And that's the principle that the creators of wealth should be able to keep much of it. It shouldn't be taken from them by fraud. It shouldn't be taken from them by violence. It shouldn't be taken from them by envious politicians. And it's clear to me that this is necessary because, you see, the things that I did in starting my company, I would have never done except for money. I mean, that had to be crucial. I would have never taken the risks that are involved. There were days when I would wake up in the morning thinking I'm going to have to call up my family and my friends who invested on the strength of my relationship and tell them I lost their money. Believe me, that doesn't feel good. That's something not just about an impersonal activity, it's something about you, about who you are. And that's the kind of thing that business entrepreneurs face. People don't do that without the prospect of very substantial gain. I think this is a serious reason why innovation is slower in nonprofit organizations. So I believe the principle the property principle for innovation, that creators of wealth should keep much of it, is the foundation of property law for growth. Now, the contract principle for coordination is just the principle that people should be able to commit to doing what they say. Contract law commits you to doing what you say, because if you don't do it, you have to pay compensation. And it's the ability to make that commitment that makes you trustworthy. If we had time, I'd show you a little game, a little agency game, in which it's unsolvable without contract law and it's solvable with contract law, and that's supposed to represent that first stage of development in a business venture. And finally, there's the organizational principle for liberty, which says that people can freely enter most lines of business. Remember, in Adam Smith's attack on mercantilism, what he was attacking especially were corporations and patents issued by the government, because they were issued to friends of the king in order to create monopoly profits and diminish competition. And he said this was a disaster. So it's important that people can freely enter most lines of business, and they can choose the firm's organization from a legal menu. When you're trying to start a corporation, there's a lot of ways of dividing up the stock. You're going to have some kind of joint stock corporation, but there's a lot of ways of doing it. And you need templates for doing it in which the legal issues have been worked out, and those are the forms that are available to you on a legal menu. Okay, so now I want to conclude, and I want to say this. If we talk about some data, I will argue that the prescription for growth, the best prescription for growth, is to do what I call legalized freedom. And I like the phrase legalized freedom, because we have to understand that freedom is not the absence of law, it's the presence of the right law. It's the presence of the law of property, contracts, and business law, like I just described to you. That's what gives you the freedom to actually innovate and create a business venture. Without that, you can't make business ventures work. You don't have that freedom of choice. On the other hand, legalized freedom also means that a business venture can't be squelched by excessive regulations. It means that there can't be too much government interference. So as a consequence, I think if we look at recent history, the legalization of freedom has occurred where you get property, contract, and business law combined with the liberalization of markets. And that's the best prescription for growth. So that's my claim. And now, why is doing business essential? Well, doing business is essential to the legal infrastructure for development, because doing business has got people to focus on the right thing, which is the living law. It's not the formal law, it's the living law. The question is, how costly is it to you to start a business? How big are the obstacles that you have to go through in order to establish the rules of property, contract, and business organization that you need in order to make that company work, in order to make that business venture have a chance of succeeding? And I also think it's essential that comparisons be made by country, because it's social sanctions that lubricate state law. It's the interaction between social sanctions and formal sanctions that make things work, and sunlight is the best disinfectant. If you shine the light of a comparative analysis on the living law of different countries, it makes people wake up, it makes people act when their law is dead. And Hernando Soto's the term, when their capital is dead. So, in my opinion, the essential activity of doing business is to legalize in freedom by improving the living law. And with that note, I'm going to turn to question and answers. Okay.
If we could follow the same protocol as yesterday, I think Professor Cooter offered some marvelous springboard thoughts for questions and answers. But if you could, just so that everyone would hear the questions, please come to a microphone on one or the other of the aisles. And please, this is day 2 of the conference, so no need to be bashful. So and I'll let him field the questions for a few minutes.
Well, just remember, if it's a question that seems too foolish for you to ask, that's because That's the question that everybody wants you to ask. Anybody? No? Oh, come now. Assuredly, this was not so uncontroversial as that. I tried not to be bland. Would you like me to say something incendiary? Would you like me to say something? No, I don't want to get involved in the politics of international development in the World Bank. That would be a mistake for me. But I think you can draw plenty of incendiary conclusions from what I've said. And I think you can see how it would reorient thinking if economists were to focus on disequilibrium in growth and innovation and the legal infrastructure for doing so. I think you can see how that might make a difference to the World Bank and to the way doing business is done.
Hello.
Yes.
My name is Christina Kushnir, and I am
Yes.
with Doing Business Index.
Yes.
Thank you so much for a very interesting presentation and thoughtful presentation. So I have 2 questions, and I'll try to formulate them as lucidly as possible. My first question is I just want to make sure I understand your point correctly. So you're saying that if the law does not make sense, if there are laws that do not help business or do not help trust between two people, then they shouldn't exist. Because I wonder, where do you draw the line between useful laws and laws that are not useful? Because if the laws don't make, and sort of, do you think that if the laws don't make sense, then they would not work? You can enforce them to a certain extent, but then they don't work. And also, my other question, so you said that the law contributes to ending the poverty of nations, but also the law can contribute to poverty of nations, because there are a lot of people who abuse laws with securing subsidies and monopolies, and sort of what are your opinions about that? Sort of, how much law do we need to conduct business? Because not all business is about innovation. I just looked up the list of 100 largest companies in the world, and it's oil and food. You don't need much innovation in those areas.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
Thank you.
It seems to me the Green Revolution has brought a substantial amount of change with respect to food, and I would have said the shale oil developments and fracking have brought a substantial change to oil. So I can't accept the fact that innovation is unimportant here. But nevertheless, your questions are very good ones and go right to the heart of some basic issues. So the first thing I want to say is this. If you believe, as I do, that Lucas was right, that when you start thinking about growth, it's hard to think about anything else, then you have a very simple criterion for evaluating the goodness of a law. I prefer to think of not so much as laws being good or bad, but better or worse, because we're looking for the best law. And we have a very simple criterion for deciding, and that is, is there an alternative law that would result in faster, sustained growth? If there's an alternative law that would result in faster, sustained growth, then according to the overtaking theorem of welfare, that new law will overtake the welfare effects of static inefficiency or of redistribution that's undesirable that it creates. And I would like to say that in the Bay Area, we've just had some surveys published last week about inequality by city and region in the United States. And it turns out that in San Francisco, there's a lot of inequality. And it also turns out there tends to be a lot of inequality where there's a lot of growth. And that's hardly surprising, because if 10% for a century is 10,000 times, and somebody owns a significant property stake in that, there's going to be a lot of inequality that's going to be produced. However, it's also the case that innovators actually capture a tiny fraction of the wealth that they create. For example, when Stephen Jobs died,
you might have thought that Americans would say, he's not one of the 1%, he's one of the 0.00001%, thank God he's dead. But nobody said that. And that's because if you're like me, you probably got a device strapped to your body like your umbilical cord that is constantly feeding you with data, and it's because of Stephen Jobs. I mean, I love the guy. I love the guy because he created a consumer surplus that was vastly greater than his personal wealth. So Stephen Jobs, the existence of a Stephen Jobs increases inequality, but it also increases welfare for most people. And if you accept this proposition of welfare overtaking, it really radically simplifies a lot of evaluations of the law, particularly a lot of the static efficiency versus growth trade-offs that you find in intellectual property law. You can just do without. Just go directly to the question of growth. So that's the first point that I wanted to make about how you decide whether it's a better law or not. For me, it's pretty straightforward. It's growth. Now, another thing that's very interesting is you talked about monopolies that are created by the state. And we're used to rent-seeking as one of the major motives for politics to create monopoly profits for the friends of politically powerful people. And that's an abuse of monopoly that's a terrible, terrible thing. But we also must bear in mind that the poster child or the paradigm for law for growth is intellectual property law. And intellectual property law is the intentional and deliberate creation of monopoly in order to drive innovation. That's what it is. We are deliberately driving innovation by creating monopoly profits. It's a very interesting system. It's a system of open competition in which just about anybody can enter. And it's a system in which there are no silver medals. There's only the gold. It's a very interesting system and a very effective system, but it belies the idea that the best legal organization of the economy is one in which there's no monopoly. Rather, the best legal organization of the economy is, by the welfare overtaking theorem, the one that drives growth the fastest, the one drives that grows the fastest, inevitably uses monopoly profits as a reward for innovation, not as a reward for being the friend of a politician. So I think I should go to another question. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
So thanks for a very interesting talk. I enjoyed your reflections in particular on the interplay between norms and laws. And I just want to draw you out a little bit on your views on this, because I mean, one thing that policymakers can do is change laws. One thing they can't typically do is change norms. So, I mean, is one implication of your view that some societies are going to be stuck in low growth traps because they have the wrong norms? If so, what do you actually do about that in practical terms?
Well, that's just a great question, and I've studied that quite a bit because I think that when you view law not just as a sanction but as a signal, you're investigating the power of law to jump from one equilibrium to another where there are multiple equilibria. If I had time, I would explain to you why I think it's inevitably the case that legal phenomena typically have multiple equilibria. And as a consequence of that, it's not the gradual improvement of the law, but the jumps in the law that bring you from one equilibrium to another that cause the greatest change. In those jumps, there's an interaction between social norms and the state law. And it's just not true that the state can't lead a change in social norms. Let me give you an example. When I was in graduate school and I lived in Boston, one of the hazards of navigating Beacon Hill was all the dog crap on the sidewalk. It was really awful. I mean, you had to stay alert. I remember one time watching a blind person walking down the street, and it was an awful sight. Well, anyway, that problem has been completely solved, and it's been completely solved by the pooper-scooper laws. And I have never once seen a single human being get a ticket for not cleaning up after their dog. Basically, what it did is it changed the balance of power in social norms, because before, when it was poopers' rights, if somebody didn't clean up after their dog, I didn't say anything about it, but now I certainly would. And the dog owners understand that. You can make the same argument for smoking. I mean, the change in the law of smoking the change in the practice of smoking is not so much the enforcement of the state rule, it's the signal of the state rule to the citizens that they should enforce a new social norm. So I think there is, in fact, an interaction of these things. If I had time, I'd give you more examples like Lord Mansfield, finding the custom that already exists and raising that to the level of the law. That's where custom leads and the state follows. But I think both are required, and both, in fact, are especially required because of the multiple equilibrium legal phenomena.
Other questions? Please.
So thank you for your very interesting presentation. I have a question as a follow-up to the previous question. What you just suggested is, or do you suggest that international differences in law, which go back to international differences in the informal rules or in the norms, the social norms, that we should strive to, say, make them equalize those norms, that this would be a political goal? I wonder whether this is possible, or whether there will always be some kind of, say, social or cultural boundaries that then define different degrees of freedom in the living law, and whether these will persist. I mean, one of the examples might be the discussion about the trade partnership between the United States and Europe, where we actually discuss different norms in terms of, for example, consumer protection, and we do have different laws, but we do have different norms, social norms about the health of food, for example. So what is your suggestion? Should we try to educate the people of the United States and Europe, or should we try to solve the problem of different social norms living together?
Very good question. Okay, well, I deal with that in a different book than the one that I described to you here. It's called The Strategic Constitution. And there's a section in the Strategic Constitution on what I call the problem of the optimal number of governments. You might think of it this way. Is it better that there be one world government? Or is it better that there be a whole lot of national governments? Or is it better that we develop some kind of world federal system, like the federal system in the United States or in Mexico, where there's a world government that has some power, but there's also powers reserved for the national governments? And I think that question is one that it really is, it's as difficult as the question of the optimal amount of centralization in the economy. But one thing we should bear in mind for sure, and that is it's a matter of getting the right function to the right level of government. If you nationalize everything, if you raise everything to the highest centralized level, then experimentation is greatly diminished. It's really important that the Doing Business report be able to rank different countries, rather than every country rather than there being only one country and therefore nothing to rank. The legal scholars in America often describe federalism as, quote, a laboratory for experimentation. And if you believe, as I do, that an awful lot of the best ideas in the world come from some mysterious source, they're not planned, they're revealed, and when their success is shown in one area, then in one place, then we imitate it. If you believe that's an important aspect of innovation, then you can't want a single homogeneous world government. You can't want uniformity of laws in this area. Now, on the other side, I'd say this. Lawyers often engaged in comparative law. Comparative law is a major subject. Comparing the laws of one country to another. And legal scholars often talked about in the past about whether there is a neutral language in which you can describe all the legal systems of the world. Well, it turns out, at least where the economy is concerned, there is one. It's called law and economics. Because one of the characteristics about economics is its principles apply across boundaries. You know, whether you're in Tokyo or you're in Bombay or Sao Paulo, if you're studying microeconomics, you're probably using the same textbook. But if you're studying constitutional law, if you're studying family law, if you're studying the law of accidents, that can't be true. You're studying national law. So when you do law and economics, it's tied to a set of policy goals, like efficiency, equality and distribution and welfare. It's tied to goals like that that are universal, that operate across boundaries. And that means that when I sit down in a seminar in Tokyo or Bombay or Sao Paulo, and it's a law and economics seminar, it may be about the law, but I understand what's going on right away. When they start with a model, I see exactly what they're talking about. So what I'm saying to you is this: the optimal number of governments is a difficult problem. Law and economics gives us a way to think about it, at least in the sphere of business law, that is not wholly driven by differences in cultures. Rather, we regard the difference in cultures as experiments to find out what's going to work best in terms of the relatively universal values at work in law and economics.
Thank you very much.